Okay, so let us continue the lecture, and now we are on the chapter of immunodeficiency syndrome. When we're talking of immunodeficiency, it is divided into primary or congenital immunodeficiencies, which are genetically determined, and secondary or acquired immunodeficiencies, which may arise as a complication of other diseases, like, for example, cancer, infection, malnutrition, or a side effect of chemoradiation therapy. Now, this is a table that is in your book, which is an example of defects in innate immunity. Primary immunodeficiency, as I have mentioned, can be caused by either genetic or inherited defects, which affects the defense mechanisms of innate immunity. When we say innate immunity, I hope you still remember that we are talking about phagocytes, natural killer cells, or complement, or the humoral and or cellular arms of adaptive immunity, which is of course mediated by your B and T lymphocytes. Usually, it is detected in infancy, and the age is between 6 to 2 years of life, usually heralded by susceptibility to recurrent infection. So, inherited defects in early innate immune response will typically affect the leukocyte function or the complement system, and it will lead to vulnerability of infection. So, as you can see here, this is a table which tells you defects in leukocyte function. It can be a defect in leukocyte adhesion, which is of two types. You have type 1 and type 2. What is defective is basically written on the second column. It can be a defect in phagolysosome function, which is typified by Shediac-Higashi syndrome. It can be an inherited defect in microbicidal activity, which is typified by chronic granulomatous disease, or a defect in TLR signaling pathway. So, when you say leukocyte adhesion deficiency, so as it is illustrated here, we have of we have two types. It is dependent on what is absent. Of course, for type 1, you have beta 2 chain uh, shared by your integrins, and the other one would be your type 2, which is the absence of adhesion molecules, Sayali-Lewis X. So, do not forget, two types. The problem is defect in leukocyte adhesion, innate immunity. When you say Shediac-Higashi, Shediac-Higashi syndrome is regarded as an autosomal recessive disorder. There is defective fusion of your phagosome and your lysosome, which results in defective phagocyte function and eventually susceptibility to infection. So, when you assay the CBC of your patient, you are expecting neutropenia. When you look at the peripheral blood smear, you would expect to have giant granules. And usually, this is accompanied by problems in melanocytes, so that usually they are albinos, as you can see in the image. Now, for chronic granulomatous disease, this is characterized by problems in bacterial killing, which renders the patient susceptible to recurrent bacterial infection. It is resulting from inherited defects in the gene encoding components of phagocyte oxidase, the phagolysosomal enzymes which generates your superoxide. The most common variant would be your X-linked defect in one of the membrane-bound components, particularly your glycoproteins. And the other one would be your autosomal recessive, this time for genes encoding your cytoplasmic components. This is called as such chronic granulomatous disease because it is expected to be macrophage-rich chronic inflammatory reaction and that tries to control the infection when the initial neutrophil defense is inadequate. So that it leads to activation of activated macrophages that tries to wall off the microbe, forming what you call as granuloma. The TLR signaling pathway are rare defects. The defects in TLR3 is a receptor for viral RNA. It results in recurrent herpes simplex encephalitis. And defects in MYD88, the adaptor protein, downstream of multiple TLRs are associated with destructive bacterial pneumonia. When we're talking of deficiency affecting the complement system, please be reminded that we are still under defects in innate immunity. Hereditary deficiencies could be in the form of particular complement, like for example, as you can see in the table, deficiency of C3, or a combination of complements, like for example, C2 and C4, which are components of your classical pathway. C2 is the most common complement protein deficiency. As it is written, you can also have a deficiency of C2 or C4 or your C3, which is required for both classical and alternative pathway. The terminal components, which is on the fourth bullet, that is basically called as your membrane attack complex. You all know that the lysis or the destruction of the organism is the endpoint of that. However, if you have deficiency of these late-acting components, it is associated with increased susceptibility to Neisseria infection. Neisseria bacteria have thin cell walls, and that makes them susceptible to the lytic actions of the complement. There is also what you call as hereditary angioedema, which is evident in this patient. It is regarded as an autosomal dominant disorder. As you can see here, the problem is the production of bradykinin. The unregulated production or increased production of bradykinin is responsible for episodes of edema which affects the skin and the mucosal surfaces. The skin and the mucosal surfaces of your patients, such as the larynx and the gastrointestinal tract. So clinically speaking, you will expect asphyxia, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and it might be triggered by trauma or emotional stress. Now, the next group is defects in adaptive immunity. So in here, we are now talking of adaptive immunity, and it is subclassified on the basis of the component that is involved. Either you're talking of B cells, or you're talking of T cells. So this illustration tells you the probable immunodeficiency for the B cell group. And again, here you have the different immunodeficiency for the T cell group. Okay, let us try to discuss it one by one. The term itself would tell you that you are looking at both problems of B and T cells, so that both humoral and cell-mediated immune responses are compromised, so that you are expecting the manifestation to be among infants. And usually it is characteristically presenting with oral candidiasis, extensive diaper rash, and failure to thrive. So these are the common manifestation of patients. The difference is dependent on whether it is X-linked or autosomal recessive if we're talking of transmission. So take note what is mutated or what is deficient. So X-linked, we're talking of mutation in cytokine receptors. Autosomal recessive, we are talking of deficiency of the enzyme adenosine deaminase. This is the most common cause of autosomal recessive SCID is adenosine deaminase deficiency. So those are the two manner of inheritance of SCID. Now, the the next one would be defect in lymphocyte maturation. So this is what we call as X-linked agammaglobulinemia, or what you call as Brutons. So you won't forget when you look at the word Bruton, that should also remind you of BTK. The problem here is failure of cell maturation because of the BTK, mutation of BTK. Bruton tyrosine kinase, or the gene that encodes it, is in chromosome X. It is associated with a pre-BCR and with a beta cell receptor complex, which are found on mature B cells. When BTK is mutated, the precursor BCR cannot deliver the signals that are needed for light chain rearrangement, and maturation is arrested. The pre-BCR cannot deliver the signals that are needed for light chain rearrangement, and so the maturation is arrested. The BTK is an important transducer of BCR signals, which stimulate and basically increase the growth, the cell survival in benign and malignant mature B cells. And inhibitors of BTK are effective therapies also for several beta cell malignancy. So it is X-linked in inheritance. The other one, so again, with severe combined from the term itself, it affects both humoral and cell-mediated immunity. I have already mentioned what you are to expect to see among these patients. And I have also enumerated some of these organisms a while ago while I was introducing it. Okay. Now, let us try to discuss X-linked severe severe combined immunodeficiency. As I was saying, X-linked SCID is the most common form. It is accounting for around 50 to 60% of cases of SCID. It is commonly seen among more common in boys than in girls. There is a genetic defect in the X-linked form of the gamma chain, so that interleukins are the ones that are affected. I am memorizing this like a phone number, 247-911-1521. I hope that would be easy for you as well to remember. 247-911-1521. Interleukins are the ones that we are talking about when we are dealing with X-linked SCID. So again, interleukins 247-911-1521. When you say autosomal recessive, as I have mentioned, the most common is adenosine deaminase. Okay, adenosine deaminase. So autosomal recessive, most common, adenosine deaminase. The mechanism, is not entirely clear, it has been proposed that the deficiency of the enzyme leads to accumulation of deoxyadenosine and its derivatives, which are toxic to rapidly dividing immature lymphocytes, especially those of the T cell lineage. Okay. Now, for defects in lymphocyte maturation, I have already said a while ago in the introduction, we have Brutons. So the B in Bruton should remind you that the problem also would be the B cells. And as I have mentioned in the introduction also, do not forget that the problem is the BTK mutation. So let's try to talk about Brutons further. Brutons is, again, B for B cells, B for BTK, and I have already mentioned this a while ago. It's involving chromosome X. The problem is B cell precursor. So with that being said, you should be reminded that you do not have mature B cells because, again, the problem with BTK would be your B cell precursors. So that you don't have mature B cells, the light chains are not produced. But take note that you have maternally produced antibodies coming from transplacental migration from the mom going into the baby. So that somewhat this is protective for a period of 6 months. After it is gone or it wanes off, then that is when infectious organisms are expected to come in, and that is when you will have this problematic infection experienced by the baby. So the classic form. So if you will remember what I have been emphasizing, it's the precursor B cell that is problematic here. So all of this should follow. Why? Again, precursor B cell would then, if they are absent or markedly decreased, of course, antibodies would be a problem. You don't have your precursor B cells, so that those areas in which you are supposed to appreciate those B cells are expected to be underdeveloped. They are also the source of your plasma cells, so that they are expected to be absent. Your T cells are normal. That's why I was saying that for B, you should remember Bruton B cell is the problem. T cells are unaffected. Next group is what we call as DiGeorge or thymic hypoplasia. This time, we're talking of T cells. So T cells, third and fourth, you must remember that. Third and fourth, thyroid, parathyroid, C cells. Okay, those are the key points to remember. The problem here is CD40L mutation. That's one. And it could also be deletion syndrome. So for DiGeorge, we're talking of T cell deficiency. We're talking of failure of development of the thymus. The third and fourth pharyngeal pouches gives rise to the thymus and the parathyroids and the sum of the C cells of the thyroid, so that because of the low level of opsonizing IgG antibodies and because of affinity maturation, in a process necessary for production of high affinity antibodies is observed. So this is classic for your DiGeorge. Other defects in lymphocyte maturation would be your bare lymphocyte syndrome, mutation in transcription factors needed for class 2. We also have what you call as the hyper-IgM syndrome. In this disorder, the affected patients have IgM, but they are deficient with IgG, IgA, and IgE antibodies. Okay. So, mature B cells are expected to be present, and they are incapable of immunoglobulin class switching and affinity maturation. I think I have a typographical error here. Again, I would like to repeat that the affected patients have IgM antibodies, but they are deficient in IgG, as in goat, IgA, and IgE. So it should be IgG. It can also be that you have what is known as common variable immunodeficiency. This entity encompasses a heterogeneous group of disorders in which the common feature is hypogammaglobulinemia, which generally affects all the antibody classes, but sometimes only IgG. The third written here is an isolated IgA deficiency, which is a common immunodeficiency caused by impaired differentiation of naive B lymphocytes to IgA-producing plasma cells. So most individuals with IgA deficiency are asymptomatic. But you must remember that because IgA is a major antibody in mucosal secretions, the mucosal defenses are weakened and infections often occur in the respiratory, gastrointestinal, and urogenital tract. So again, ito tama na. This is IgM, hyper IgM. So the deficiency, as I have corrected a while ago, should be IgA, IgA, IgG, and IgE. Okay. I was talking about CD40L as well. So again, it is emphasized here, X-linked mutation in CD40. So as I have said, IgM, CD40, and the common organism would be your pneumocystis. For common variable immunodeficiency, again, just to emphasize some points, hypogammaglobulinemia is something that I have talked about already a while ago. It is sometimes only IgG. So to add up, you have now your BAFF, which is a receptor for cytokine, and of course your ECOS as additional information for this disease. I have already discussed this, isolated IgA deficiency. I have already emphasized that infections are commonly occurring in the mucosa where IgA levels are expected to be high. We also have our X-linked lymphoproliferative disorder, in which the virus to remember is this Epstein-Barr. The disease associated with it are basically the following: infectious mononucleosis and B-cell tumors, like for example, lymphoma. In 80% of cases, the disease is due to mutation in the gene encoding an adapter molecule called SLAM-associated protein, otherwise known as SAP. SAP binds to a family of cell surface molecules which is involved in the activation of natural killer cells and T and B lymphocytes, including the signaling lymphocyte activation molecule, or otherwise known as SLAM. So if you have a defective SAP, it will attenuate NK and T cell activation, and it will result in increased susceptibility to viral infection, particularly Epstein-Barr. Okay, so let us try to discuss it further. So you have your X-linked lymphoproliferative disorder, as I have mentioned. You have EBV. I have here already the SLAM and the SAP as what I was trying to point out a while ago. So the other defects in lymphocyte activation would be your defect in T helper 1 response, which is associated with atypical microbacterial infection. The syndrome is called Mendelian susceptibility to mycobacterial disease. And the other one would be inherited defects in T helper 17 response, which can lead to chronic mucocutaneous candidiasis and bacterial infection. This is otherwise known as Jobs syndrome. So We are now on the part of the chapter in which we are dealing with immunodeficiencies associated with systemic diseases. And the first on the list is what we call as Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome. This is an X-linked disease which is characterized by thrombocytopenia, eczema, recurrent infection, and there is progressive loss of T cells in the peripheral blood and in the lymph nodes. So the W there should remind you that the problem is the WASP protein. The T here should remind you that the thymus is morphologically normal, at least in the early course of the disease, but there is progressive loss of T lymphocytes in the peripheral blood and in the lymph nodes, particularly in the paracortical areas. So again, W here should remind you of where the mutation is. Here, it should be reminded, or you should be reminded that the problem here is, of course, your T cells. So the problem is T cells, and for the B cells, the patients do not make antibodies to polysaccharide antigens, and the response to protein antigen is poor. If you will invert W, that will be letter M, and that will tell you or remind you that the IgM levels are low and the IgG are usually normal. There is IgA, the IgA and IgE are often elevated, and they are prone to develop what you call as B-cell lymphomas. So do not forget, WASP, the locus is chromosome X. The thymus may be normal, but then again, the second tier there should remind you that the T cells are the ones that are affected. You invert W, you get an M, and that tells you that the IgM are the ones that are low. The IgG is normal. The A and E are often elevated for this group of patients. So I have here a classic case of a patient presenting with, again, do not forget the signs and symptoms expected would be thrombocytopenia. So petechia is expected in the skin of your patients. You'll have eczema in this patient. It is basically around the mouth, and marked vulnerability to infection, usually in the form of pneumonia. Now, next one on the list is ataxia telangiectasia. This is autosomal recessive. This word should remind you of the abnormality in the gait. And of course, this word should remind you of vascular malformation that is expected of this patient. There is abnormality of switch isotype antibody, mainly IgA and IgG2. How do I remind myself of that? Well, A here is IgA, and the second word is telangiectasia. So the G is there, so it should remind me that I am looking at IgA and IgG. And basically, the second word is telangiectasia, which reminds me that the problem there for IgG is particularly subtype 2. So the T cell defects are usually less pronounced, and it is associated with thymic hypoplasia. So again, the ataxia begins with an A, and the gene here is chromosome 11, which encodes for a protein which we call as ATM. Now, let us go now to we're done with the primary immunodeficiencies. Let us now proceed with the secondary or acquired immunodeficiencies. This is often encountered in individuals with a primary problem, like, for example, cancer, diabetes, other metabolic disorders, malnutrition, or patients receiving chemo or radiation therapy. Um, One thing that is described well in your book is particularly HIV, which is characteristically caused by depletion of CD4 helper T cells. Um, AIDS or HIV is caused by a retrovirus, which is characteristically, as I have mentioned, the endpoint is depletion of CD4 helper 2 cells. And when this happens, you enter a phase of the disease which eventually may be labeled as HIV or human immunodeficiency virus, which is characterized by profound immunosuppression, opportunistic infection, secondary neoplasm, and neurologic manifestation. Well, this is an initiative of Dr. Atibagos just to show you he is my partner lecturing this topic. And he is showing us the data of the Philippines as to obtained from the DOH website regarding the incidence of HIV in our country. Now, he is also giving you this or gave us this, which is the number of diagnosed cases, comparatively speaking, 2017 to 2019. And of course, the different regions in which it is commonly seen. He took also this from the WHO website, which gives you an idea of this time how it is globally. So these are some additional reference for us to look into as we study HIV or basically AIDS. So as to population or by race, as you can see here, it is very common among Black Africans. So if we are going to go back using your textbook this time, these are some of the people who are more commonly infected. Those are particularly MSM, men having sex with men, accounting for around 50% of cases. And of course, the others are already enumerated, like heterosexual, IV drug users, or infection transplacentally passed among newborns. Now, among the transmission, sexually transmitted or sexual transmission is the dominant mode of infection worldwide. Now, the problem here is, of course, unprotected sex, and the virus is carried in the semen and it enters the recipient's body through abrasions in the rectal or oral mucosa or by direct contact with mucosa lining cells. The viral transmission can occur in two ways: direct inoculation into the blood, which is usually breached by trauma, and infection of dendritic cells or CD4 positive T cells within the mucosa. So other means of transmission would include your parenteral transmission, like for example, drug addicts, those that are at risk because of using repeated needles, hemophiliacs, transfusion patients as a form of treatment are of course also at risk because of the blood transfusion that they usually have to undergo. But you must remember that we're actually screening this in the blood products, but unless you use NAT or nucleic acid testing, serologic markers usually have a window period that sometimes the presence of the virus is not detected as the units are screened. Now, so this again is giving you the third most common, and that would be mother to infant transmission. Of course, this comes from infected mothers, and it is transmitted to the baby in utero either by transplacental spread during delivery, through an infected birth canal, or after birth by ingestion of breast milk. These are the common three routes of transmission during birth, intrapartum, and the immediate period thereafter, which we call as the peripartum period. So, sorry. So needle stick injuries, around 0.3% of cases. Again, but medtechs are always reminded, or because basically they're the ones collecting the sample, to never rake up the needle, because this is a common problem of healthcare workers, and this practice should be eliminated. So, as I have said, it is a non-transforming human retrovirus. It belongs to the lentivirus family. It is two genetically different and related forms are called HIV-1 and 2. It is already enumerated here where the variant is commonly seen: HIV-1, US, Europe, Central Africa, and HIV-2 for West Africa and India. So you have here the structure of the HIV. The HIV virion is characteristically spherical. You have the major capsid protein. You have the nucleocapsid protein. You have copies of the viral genomic RNA and the viral enzymes in the form of protease, reverse transcriptase, and integrase. Protease, reverse transcriptase, and integrase. P24 is regarded as the most abundant viral antigen, and it is detected by ELISA, and it is widely used to diagnose HIV infection. The viral core is surrounded by a matrix protein, which we call as P17. Lies underneath is the virion envelope. Studying the virion envelope are two viral glycoproteins, particularly GP120 and GP41, which are critical for HIV infection of cells. The HIV-1 RNA genome contains the GAG, pol, and envelope genes, which are also typical of retroviruses. So, as I was saying, you have here an illustration again of the different roles, and basically the role of each are already defined, as you can see. So you have, as I have mentioned, the GAG and the pol genes are, for example, large precursor proteins that are cleaved by the viral protease to yield the mature proteins. In addition, we also have the other retroviral accessory genes, like, for example, the TAT, the REV, the VIF. Okay, we have the VIF, we have the NEF, we have the VPR, and the VPU. So these are other accessory genes encoded. Now, there are two major targets of HIV, and basically that is the central nervous system and the immune system. I have already mentioned to you a while ago that depletion of CD4 T cells is basically for the immune side. So you are expected to have a count, a monitoring count of your CD4, and profound immune deficiency, primarily affecting CD4 T cells, cell-mediated immunity, is the hallmark of AIDS. So why is it that your CD4 is going down? Okay, the CD4 is going down because basically your virus can exert a direct cytopathic effect and kill your CD4 T cells. It can also induce apoptosis and pyroptosis, and also destruction of the architecture and cellular components, which are supposedly where your T cells are produced. The immature precursor T cells are also lost, and you have fusion of infected and uninfected cells with formation of giant cells, which usually die within hours. So the fusion, or these giant cells on progressively infected cells, binds to CD4 molecules on uninfected T cells, followed by cell fusion. As I have mentioned, they will die within a few hours. This is what we call a syncytia formation. For this reason, this is often referred to as the syncytia-inducing virus in because of its property. So these are the ways by which the virus depletes our CD4 T cells. So I have here a very simplified life cycle, and you have in your book, particularly figure dash 6.41 in your book, the life cycle of your HIV, which actually shows you how it enters the cell. The HIV infects the cells by using the CD4 molecule as a receptor and various chemokine receptors as your co-receptors. So I am basically at this point. The requirement for CD4 binding explains the selective tropism. So by tropism means predilection of the virus for CD4 T cells and other CD4 positive T cells like monocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells. So binding to CD4 is not sufficient for infection. However, HIV GP120 must bind to other cell surface molecules like co-receptors for it to enter the cell. So as chemokine receptors, particularly CCR5 and CXCR4, serve this role. HIV isolates can then be distinguished by the use of these receptors. So now it is within the cell. So as it goes inside, okay, you have here now at the level of the nucleus. So let us try to use this. So as it enters, so as it enters the nucleus, as I was saying, the chemokine receptors, particularly CXCR5 and CXCR4, will serve this role. Now, first there will be membrane fusion. So as you can see here, the viral genome is basically going inside, and you now have the life cycle inside the nuclei. This process would entail, so the initial step in the infection is binding of the GP120 envelope glycoprotein to your CD4. It leads to conformational changes, which produces the new recognition site on GP120 for receptors, which, as I have mentioned, is CCR5 or CXCR4. The binding to the co-receptors will induce a conformational change in your GP41 and results in exposure of the hydrophobic region. This will then allow it to insert into the cell membrane of the target cell and lead to the fusion of the virus and the host cell membrane. So this will allow the virus core containing the HIV genome to enter the cell. The requirement for HIV binding to co-receptors is very important in the pathogenesis of AIDS. So as it gets inside, okay, we can now do viral replication. Once it is internalized, the RNA genome of the virus undergoes reverse transcription. It leads to synthesis of a double-stranded complementary DNA. So we are now at this point. It leads to a synthesis of a double-stranded complementary DNA. In quiescent T cells, the HIV complementary DNA may remain in the cytoplasm in a linear episomal form. However, in dividing T cells, the complementary DNA circularizes, it enters the nucleus and integrates into the host genome. After integration, the provirus may be silent for months or years or form a latent infection. Alternatively, proviral DNA may be transcribed and the viral particles can actually bud out. So we are now here from the cell membrane and then eventually repeat the process over again. Virus is released and infects again the next CD4 T cells. Okay. So, as I have mentioned, there is somewhat a period of latency. So again, this is another one which tells you what I just finished. This is somewhat simplified. I took this from another source, but I find it very useful, very easy to understand. So, but this one is what is in your book. So basically, these are supplementary materials. So I was telling you a while ago of a latent phase. So let us now go to the different phases of HIV infection. So the first one is what you call as the acute retroviral syndrome. It is characterized by infection of your CD4 T cells, which express your CCR5 in the mucosal lymphoid tissues, and death of many infected cells. So in here, the mucosal infection is often associated with damage to the epithelium, defects in the mucosal barrier, and it is followed by dissemination of the virus and development of the acute immune response. As the HIV spreads, the individual mounts an antiviral, humoral, and cell-mediated immune response, which responses leads to seroconversion, usually within 3 to 7 weeks, and the development of virus-specific CD8 cytotoxic T cells. Clinically speaking, the acute retroviral syndrome is the clinical presentation of the initial spread of the virus and the host response. So now, it is followed by what we call as the middle or the chronic phase, or otherwise known as the phase of clinical latency. In here, you should check the lymph nodes and the spleen of your patients because they are the sites of continuous HIV replication and cell destruction. During this period, the disease, few or no clinical manifestations of HIV are present. That's why few or no clinical manifestations. That's why they are this phase is called as clinical latency. Although the majority of the peripheral blood T cells do not harbor the virus, the destruction of CD4 T cells within lymphoid tissues continues. So the mechanisms that I have enumerated to you a while ago is where it is happening. It's basically in the middle chronic phase, so that the CD4 lymphocytes are expected to steadily go down, and it may take years for it to go down to a level that is very significant, which is the cutoff is around 200. When you reach that, you are now entering the next phase, which is clinical AIDS. So again, just a reiteration of the life cycle. And so what are the major abnormalities in the immune function in AIDS? So you have lymphopenia, you have decreased T cell function in vivo, you have altered T cell function in vitro, you have polyclonal B cell activation, and you've got altered monocyte or macrophage function. So with all of this, we are expecting that the T and B cells, particularly the T cells, are expected to go down. As I have said, the CD4 level is something that you should closely monitor. Now, the typical adult patient with AIDS presents with fever, weight loss, diarrhea, generalized lymphadenopathy, multiple opportunistic infection, neurologic disease, and in many cases, secondary neoplasms. So when you enter this phase, you are now looking at more likely a patient with AIDS. The CNS damage is because of the infection is carried to the CNS by infected monocytes. The exact mechanism of injury is unclear. So let us try to talk a bit more about its pathogenesis. So as I have said, The early infection is, let's say, it's sexually transmitted, so damage to the mucosa is what we will use. So in the middle phase, which is the latent infection, you are expecting the CD4 count to be going down, okay? But initially, the acute retroviral illness phase, and then you have the clinical latency. So the CD4 is expected to go down, and as I have mentioned, to a critical level to around 200 as the cutoff is what you should monitor among this patient. The neurologic manifestation, the clinical syndrome is associated with uh, HIV-associated neurocognitive disorder, otherwise known as HAND. Microglia cells in the CNS are, as I have mentioned, the predominant type in the brain that are infected with HIV. It is believed that HIV is carried into the brain by infected T cells or monocytes. So take note, have 2 points of attack. Mainly would be your immune system, and secondly would be your central nervous system involvement. So once it spreads, of course, you have here the graphical representation. This time you have the early period of primary infection. So let's take a look at that and contrast it here, which is supposed to be the different antibodies or tests that you can request to diagnose the disease. So let's take this up first. During the early period after primary infection, there is dissemination of the virus. So as I have mentioned, immune response is expected, and this often presents as an acute viremia or acute viral syndrome. Eventually, it goes into the chronic phase, or this is otherwise known as the period of clinical latency. Take note that in here, the viral replication continues, the CD4 T cell count continually decreases in the mechanisms of which I have explained to you a while ago. So for your immune response to HIV, the cytotoxic T lymphocytes is detectable to as early as 2 to 3 weeks after the initial infection. So this one, okay? And it peaks to around 9 to 12 weeks. So that's the peak. Marked expansion of virus-specific CD8 T cells occurs during this time. Up to 10% of patients with cytotoxic T cells may have HIV specific at 12 weeks. The humoral immune response to HIV peaks to about 12 weeks. So you can, this is the natural course of antibody detection. So this is what I was emphasizing since the start of the topic. You have to monitor the CD4 count, and when it reaches less than 200, usually that's a cause of alarm, because more likely you will then enter the clinical AIDS phase, okay? The final progression or the final phase is progression to AIDS. It is characterized by a breakdown of your host defense mechanism, a dramatic increase in the viral load, and a severe life-threatening clinical disease. For most patients with HIV infection, it progressed to AIDS after a chronic phase lasting for around 7 to 10 years. So that's the usual, 7 to 10 years. This man, well, this is widely in the net, and that is basically a man on AIDS phase already. So AIDS is, again, as I have said, the final progression. You may have opportunistic infection, of course, because the CD4 count is expected to be low. So the typical patients would be fever, long-standing, fatigue, weight loss, diarrhea, generalized lymph node enlargement, opportunistic infection sets in, and even secondary neoplasm. So these are examples of opportunistic infections. They account for the majority of deaths in untreated patients with AIDS. Approximately 15 to 30% of untreated HIV-infected people develop pneumonia caused by pneumocystis during the course of the disease. So many patients will also present with opportunistic infection, and candidiasis is regarded as the most common fungal infection in patients with AIDS. Cytomegalovirus may cause disseminated disease, or it may be localized to the eye and the GI tract. Disseminated bacterial infection with atypical mycobacteria also occurs at this phase. There are a variety of opportunistic infection that may target the CNS. Cryptococcus occurs in about 10% of patients with AIDS. Other infections preferentially involve the gastrointestinal tract and the genitalia. As for tumors, Kaposi sarcoma is a vascular tumor. It is one of the most common neoplasm that is seen among patients with AIDS. It is characterized by proliferation of spindle-shaped cells that express both endothelial and smooth muscle lineage. It can also be primary lymphoma of the brain or invasive cancer of the uterine and cervix. So, as I was saying, Kaposi sarcoma. Now, it in some patients, it may be a form of B-cell lymphomas. Lymphomas occurs at a markedly increased rate among individuals with AIDS. Roughly 5% of AIDS patients will present with lymphoma, and usually the incidence of lymphoma is its association is partially explained by T-cell immunodeficiency. The characteristic, sometimes it is often related as well to EBV-related lymphomas, EBV or Epstein-Barr virus-related lymphomas. Other types of cancers are also seen, like that of the cervix and anal cancer. It is associated, particularly squamous cell. We're talking of squamous cell here. So it is associated with increased risk of human papilloma virus, which is associated with uterine cervix and anal carcinoma, as I have said, SCC type. So HPV is intimately associated with SCCA in the cervix, and the precursor lesion of which is what we call as squamous intraepithelial lesions. Okay, so this is a model for the pathogenesis of B-cell lymphomas in HIV infection. So HIV infection results in changes that may cooperate to produce B-cell lymphoma, and an increase in T follicular helper cells early in the course of the disease is postulated as well, but its basis is unknown. So as I have mentioned, take note of the tumors that are common: Kaposi sarcoma, lymphomas, cervical carcinoma, and also anal squamous cell carcinoma. So this is the typical lesion of Kaposi sarcoma. As you can see, as I have mentioned, they are vascular tumors. These are the typical proliferation of spindle-shaped cells, which when you do immunostain will lead you to both markers for endothelial and smooth muscle cells. It's expected to be a vascular tumor, so that it suggests that it arises from primitive precursors of vascular channels. So as I have mentioned, lymphomas are also very common, and this is a classic histologic exam of a lymph node exhibiting lymphoma. So you can give retrovirals as a form of treatment. The agents are available in the market, 25 antiretroviral drugs. You tend to decrease the viral load by increasing also the CD4 count. So these are some of the treatment modalities that can be employed. So you have here the different, again, antiretrovirals and how does it or its usage in the management of patients. Okay. So the last topic is called amyloidosis. It is a condition associated with a number of inherited and inflammatory disorders in which extracellular deposits of fibrillar proteins are responsible for tissue damage and eventually functional compromise. So, as I have said, the fibrillar deposits are glycosaminoglycans, including heparan sulfate, dermatan sulfate, and plasma proteins, particularly amyloid P. So, what are amyloid proteins? So, amyloid, basically, you have, there are around 20 different proteins which can aggregate to form your amyloids by electron microscopy, which is this. Okay. All types of amyloid usually do have a diameter of approximately 7.5 to 10 nanometer. You can do X-ray crystallography and infrared spectroscopy. Spectroscopy would reveal the characteristic beta-pleated sheet configuration. If you do a special stain, which is here, that is what you call as the Congo red, and the expected would be an apple green birefringence under polarized light microscopy. So this special stain can be employed on tissues, and when you have that apple green birefringence, then that concludes the deposition of amyloid on that particular tissue. So there are three common forms of amyloid. You have the AL protein, the AA protein, and the beta amyloid protein. And it's basically here what are the usual tumors associated or the disease associated with it. There are also rare forms of amyloid called transthyretin. I think there's a typographical error there. Again, transthyretin, which is a normal serum protein that binds and transport thyroxine and retinol. You have beta-2 that should be microglobulin. It is a component of MHC class 1 in a normal serum protein. It is often depositing among patients on long-term hemodialysis. And the third would be your, in a minority of cases, prion diseases in the CNS, the misfolded prion proteins aggregates in the extracellular space and acquire the structural and staining characteristic patterns of amyloid. So, amyloidosis results from abnormal folding of proteins, which becomes insoluble, aggregate, and deposits as fibrils in the extracellular matrix. So as you can see here, this is the illustration which is showing the proposed mechanism underlying the deposition of the major forms of amyloid fibrils. As I have said, we have three major types, the AL, the AA, and the third component, the beta-amyloid protein. The AL protein is made up of complete immunoglobulin light chains, the amino terminal fragments of light chains, or both. The AA is a form of amyloid derived from a unique non-immunoglobulin protein made by the liver. It is found in the fibrils. It's created by proteolysis of a larger precursor called SAA, or serum amyloid associated protein, that is synthesized in the liver and circulates in the blood bound to high density lipoprotein. The last column constitutes the core of cerebral plaques, which are found in Alzheimer's disease, as well as the amyloid deposited in the walls of cerebral blood vessels in individuals with this disease. So do not forget sites and the types. So it can be localized or systemic. The localized or systemic variant can be in association with a variety of primary disorders, including monoclonal beta cell proliferation and chronic inflammatory diseases. So I have here, for example, Alzheimer's, okay, familial conditions with amyloid deposits, and amyloidosis associated with dialysis, as I have mentioned a while ago, particularly the beta-2 microglobulin. So you have this table 6-17, which enumerates the classification of amyloidosis, and the major fibril protein is also basically indicated in the third column. To differentiate it as to types, are you looking at systemic, hereditary, or localized? So when you look at it under the microscope, again, let me just remind you, you can do an H&E stain, and that is if you have suspicion for amyloid, you need to confirm that, request a special stain, and that special stain is what we call as Congo red. As you can see, these are the pink-red amyloid deposits that is diagnostic of the disease. So you can do fluorescent microscopy. So again, these are amyloid deposits, the darker pink-red structures. You can do polarized microscopy, and do not forget the endpoint, as I have mentioned, would be yellow-green birefringence or yellow-green birefringence of the deposits employing polarizing microscopy. This is a section of the spleen, and it may be in apparent grossly or may cause moderate to marked splenomegaly because it is expected that the spleen is to be enlarged to around 800 grams. The deposition is expected, as I have mentioned. It is largely limited to the splenic follicles. It produces a tapioca-like granules, as you can see on the left-hand side. And in our language, that is what we call as sago spleen on gross inspection. In other pattern, the amyloid will involve the walls of the splenic sinuses and the connective tissue framework. So as I have mentioned, you have to do H&E followed by Congo red, and ideally supplemented by polarizing microscopy to observe for the birefringence, which, as I have mentioned, is expected to be yellowish green in appearance. Okay, so that ends my lecture, and thank you very much for your kind attention.